Hi, my name is Rebecca Hoyt and welcome to another Fotog Friday. In the last video, we wrapped up our discussion on aperture by talking about depth of field. Today we're going to talk about that third element that affects exposure, which is ISO. ISO is probably the most abstract concept. There isn't really something visual to demonstrate for it inside of the camera. With shutter speed, we took you inside the camera and showed you those shutter curtains moving at different speeds. And with aperture, we actually showed you inside the lens the whole size changing and the amount of light being let in. Similarly, ISO affects exposure, but what's different about it is that it's all about the technology. It's all about the sensor and how sensitive it is to light. There's nothing really visual that I can show you. The best way to demonstrate is to show you some images and show you how ISO affects exposure. But before we do that, the basic concept is this. ISO is an element that measures the amount of light that is sensitive to your sensor. The lower your ISO number is, the less sensitive it is to light. As you raise that number up, the more light is hitting your sensor and therefore a higher exposure you will have. So here's an example. So I took these pictures of these ferns on our back porch, and I apologize, they're kind of dying and turning brown, but we'll ignore that point. I took this first image here at ISO 200 with a 35mm lens at f1.4 at 1/1600th of a second. So similar to before with aperture and with shutter speed, I left everything the same except the ISO so that you can see how it affects exposure. So as we go up, this one was shot at ISO 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and 12,800. It's very high. But as you can see here, as you go across the board and as you raise that ISO number up, if you leave all the other elements of your camera the same, you will allow more light to hit your sensor and therefore have a higher exposure. So now that you see how changing your ISO affects exposure, we're going to talk about the effects that changing your ISO have on your images and on the quality of your images. The higher you raise your ISO, yes, you do get more sensitivity to light to your sensor, which is a great thing, especially in low light settings, but you also introduce something called noise, or as other people call it, grain. The higher you raise your ISO, the less quality your image will be, simply because it's artificially letting in more light, so you're going to sacrifice quality. You'll start to see some graininess and grittiness on your images, and it affects a lot of things, not just the quality of the image, but it affects contrast and color, and it really adds a whole new element to your images. So for me personally, I like to keep my ISO as low as possible at all times and only raise it up when I have no other options to let in more light to my images. Here are some examples of how ISO introduces some grain and noise to your images. I took this picture with my Nikon D90, which is a crop sensor camera, to demonstrate for you how ISO introduces grain. This first image was shot at ISO 200, and I shot these all on a tripod. This was with a macro lens, so it was shot at f3.2 at 1/13th of a second. Now as I raise my ISO up, I also sped up my shutter speed, because the higher you raise your ISO, the more light you're letting in, therefore the less open my shutter needed to be. I'll get more into that next week about how to use the three elements of exposure together, but for today we're just focusing on ISO and the effect it has on noise and grain. This image was shot at ISO 400, this one was shot at ISO 800, 1600, ISO 3200, and 6400. So as you look closer here, you can really see as you zoom in at ISO 6400 just how gritty and grainy it is. To jump back to ISO 200, you see that it's the exact same image, same exposure, but you don't have nearly as much of that grain and that grittiness, or as some call it, noise. And you can really especially see the comparison as you compare ISO 200 to ISO 6400. To take the comparison one step further, I took a very similar image using a full-frame camera body using my Nikon D700, and I'll do the same comparison again, but then compare the two camera bodies side by side. So this is ISO 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6,400, and the Nikon D700 goes all the way up to 12,800, which is very high ISO. I'll jump back to the highest one, which is 6,400, and as you can see here, as we get closer on the same image, you definitely see some grain, but in comparison to the grain that you see on the D90, it's the same ISO setting, same exposure, but the D90 has a lot more grain and a lot more noise. This is a perfect example of why I decided to upgrade to a D700 last year. As a wedding photographer, I'm faced with many different lighting scenarios, particularly low light in wedding ceremonies. One of the best things that I invested in as a photographer was a full-frame camera body, particularly for the very thing you just saw. I'm able to shoot at high ISOs in those low light settings when I don't want to use flash and have minimal grain in comparison to other camera bodies. It's just something that you may want to look into as you're exploring the type of photography you want to do, and particularly if you're faced with a lot of low light situations and you don't want to use flash, finding a camera body that performs really well in low light is going to be really beneficial to you and ultimately will make a big improvement in the quality of your images. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love for you to leave a comment, let me know what you thought of the video. I love making these videos and I want to continue, but I just want to make sure that there's still an audience out there watching. We'll be wrapping up the Back to Basics series next week, and I'd love for you to let me know what you'd like to see next. I'll start a new mini-series within the Fotog Friday video blogs, and I'd love your feedback to know what types of things you're interested in learning about. But for today, I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a fantastic weekend.
Don't sweat the technique. Don't sweat the technique.